Consciousness is both the most intimate thing you know and the most mysterious. It is so close to you that you rarely stop to notice it, and yet it shapes every experience you have ever had. I am speaking now, not to your beliefs, not to your ideas, but to that simple fact of being aware, the feeling that you are here, listening, present. That feeling is the doorway to everything that follows. The strange thing is this: the very moment you become aware that you are conscious, life becomes richer and more complicated at the same time. You gain depth, imagination, creativity, and meaning, but you also gain worry, doubt, regret, and fear. Consciousness opens heaven and hell together. You cannot have one without the other. So let me ask you something directly, and I invite you to answer honestly in the comments below. Have you ever noticed that the same awareness that allows you to appreciate beauty also allows you to torture yourself with thoughts about what might go wrong? That paradox is not an accident. It is the nature of human consciousness itself. Here is a simple fact we often overlook. Human beings are not merely conscious, they are self-conscious. We do not just experience pain, we know that we are in pain. We do not just feel joy, we know that it may end. This reflective quality of consciousness is what gives rise to art, language, science, and philosophy. It is also what makes possible anxiety, shame, and existential dread. Consciousness gives me the ability to remember the past and imagine the future. This is a tremendous evolutionary advantage. It allows learning, planning, and cooperation, but it also means I can relive mistakes endlessly and suffer in advance over events that may never happen. The nervous system reacts to imagined danger almost as strongly as to real danger. Thought alone can create suffering. This is where consciousness becomes a curse, not because awareness is wrong, but because it is misunderstood. When awareness identifies completely with its own thoughts, it becomes trapped in them. The mind begins to believe that every thought is a fact, every emotion a verdict, every story a truth. From an early age, we are taught to use consciousness primarily as a tool for control. Control your impulses, control your emotions, control your future, control how others see you. But consciousness was never designed to function as a tyrant. It was meant to be a witness, a space in which experience unfolds. When consciousness is used to dominate experience, it turns against itself. You begin watching your own thoughts anxiously, correcting yourself, judging yourself, narrating yourself. Awareness collapses inward and becomes tension. This is what most people call being in their head. Notice how often people say, "I shouldn't feel this way," or "I shouldn't think this." That sentence alone reveals the cursed side of consciousness. Feeling and thinking are happening naturally, but self-awareness has turned them into a problem. The mind is now arguing with reality instead of listening to it. Here is an argument worth considering carefully. Suffering increases not simply because of painful events, but because consciousness adds a story of resistance to them. Pain happens. Then thought says, "This should not be happening to me." And that thought multiplies the pain into suffering. Consciousness allows meaning, but it also demands meaning where none is required. Not everything that happens needs to be explained, justified, or turned into a lesson. Yet the mind insists on doing so because explanation gives the illusion of control. Another fact you can verify in your own experience is this: the more desperately you try to be happy through thought, the more restless you become. Consciousness cannot be ordered into peace. It can only notice when peace is already present. Happiness pursued as a goal recedes. Happiness allowed arrives quietly. The blessing of consciousness is reflection. The curse is rumination. Reflection observes gently and moves on. Rumination circles endlessly, chewing on the same ideas. One opens understanding, the other tightens the knot. Much of modern distress comes from living almost entirely at the level of mental abstraction. We think about life more than we live it. Sensation, breath, movement, and sound are pushed aside by commentary. The present moment becomes a concept instead of an experience. Yet consciousness itself is not the enemy. The problem is confusing its contents with its nature. Thoughts, emotions, and images appear in consciousness, but they are not consciousness itself. Awareness is the space in which they arise, not the things that arise. When this is forgotten, consciousness feels claustrophobic. When it is remembered, consciousness feels spacious. The same awareness that once felt like a burden reveals itself as freedom. So, consciousness is a blessing and a curse only when it is half understood. Without understanding, it overwhelms. With understanding, it liberates. And understanding does not come from accumulating ideas, but from noticing what is already happening. One of the most revealing things about consciousness is that it does not merely witness suffering, it often holds on to it. Not because pain is enjoyable, but because pain feels familiar. Pain gives shape to identity. When consciousness says, "This is my struggle," it creates a center, a reference point, and the mind clings to that center, even when it hurts. Here is a fact many people resist at first. A great deal of psychological suffering is maintained unconsciously because it answers the question of who we are. Without a problem to solve, the ego feels unnecessary. Without conflict, it feels invisible. So consciousness, misused, keeps reopening old wounds just to reassure itself that it exists. This is why letting go feels dangerous. When suffering has been woven into your self-image, peace feels like annihilation. The mind asks, if I am not my anxiety, my ambition, my trauma, my story, then what is left? That question terrifies the ego, because the ego is made of answers. The curse of consciousness deepens when awareness turns into self-surveillance. Instead of simply noticing thoughts and feelings, you begin monitoring them. You evaluate yourself constantly. You try to correct yourself in real time. Awareness becomes tight, defensive, and exhausting. Notice how often people confuse self-awareness with self-criticism. They say they are aware of their flaws, but what they mean is that they are judging themselves endlessly. That is not clarity. That is consciousness turned into an internal courtroom. Here is an argument that deserves careful attention. Consciousness does not suffer by nature. It suffers through resistance. Pain allowed to be present moves through the system. Pain resisted becomes psychological suffering. Awareness that allows experience is spacious. Awareness that fights experience becomes constricted. This is why attempts to eliminate negative thoughts usually fail. Consciousness cannot be coerced into peace. The moment you declare war on part of your experience, you divide yourself. One part becomes the controller, the other the enemy. And that division is suffering itself. The blessing of consciousness begins to return when observation replaces control. When I notice fear without trying to fix it, fear loses much of its power. When I watch a thought without following it, the thought weakens naturally. Nothing needs to be forced. There is an intelligence in consciousness that knows how to rebalance itself, but it does not respond to aggression. It responds to understanding. Insight transforms more deeply than effort because it removes the cause rather than fighting the symptom. Another subtle curse of consciousness is its relationship with time. Awareness can travel backward into memory and forward into imagination so vividly that the present moment becomes an afterthought. You live in anticipation or regret, while life itself continues unnoticed. Ask yourself this honestly. How often are you actually here, sensing, breathing, listening, and how often are you rehearsing the future or replaying the past? That single observation explains much of human unease. Yet consciousness also gives you the ability to notice this wandering. The moment you see that attention has drifted, awareness has already returned. That noticing is not failure, it is success. It is the blessing correcting the curse in real time. You do not need to destroy thought. Thought is an extraordinary tool. But when you mistake thought for the totality of consciousness, life feels cramped. When thought is seen as something that appears in awareness, space opens naturally. This is where humility enters the picture. Consciousness realizes it does not need to micromanage existence. Breathing happens. Understanding arises. Action unfolds. Life has been living itself long before you began narrating it. The more you trust this, the less consciousness feels like a burden. It becomes what it always was, an open field in which experience plays, rather than a judge that must constantly decide its worth. When consciousness is finally understood in a lived way, not as an idea, not as a philosophy, but as direct experience, something quietly dissolves. The struggle to use awareness correctly falls away. You stop asking whether consciousness is helping or harming you, because you see that it was never separate from life in the first place. Here is a fact that changes everything once it is seen clearly. Consciousness is not something you have. It is something you are participating in. The idea that I possess awareness is itself a thought appearing in awareness. When that is noticed, the sense of being trapped inside your own mind loosens. The blessing of consciousness reveals itself when you stop demanding that it make you comfortable. Awareness was never meant to guarantee happiness. It was meant to allow experience fully. When you allow experience, even discomfort has a place, a movement, and an ending. The curse dissolves when you stop personalizing every sensation. Pain is felt, but it is no longer interpreted as proof of failure. Fear arises, but it is no longer treated as a command. Thought appears, but it is no longer mistaken for truth. Each experience is given room to be what it is. This does not make you detached or cold. In fact, it makes you more intimate with life. When you are no longer defending yourself against experience, you can meet it directly. Colors seem brighter, sounds feel closer. Relationships become more honest because you are no longer using others to stabilize your identity. Another truth becomes obvious here. Consciousness does not need to be constantly occupied. It does not need endless stimulation, explanation, or improvement. Silence is not a threat to awareness. Silence is one of its natural expressions. This is why moments of peace often arrive when you stop trying to achieve them. Walking without a destination, listening without preparing a reply, sitting without a goal. In these moments, consciousness returns to its original ease. The mind has a habit of turning everything into a project, even awakening. But consciousness cannot be completed. It cannot be perfected. It can only be lived. The moment you stop trying to finish yourself, life begins to feel whole. Compassion naturally deepens at this stage. You see that everyone is struggling with the same misunderstanding, trying to use consciousness to escape discomfort instead of understanding it. Seeing this, judgment loses its grip. You do not excuse harmful behavior, but you no longer need to hate the person caught in it. Even the fear of death changes shape. Consciousness realizes that everything it can observe, body, thought, memory, identity, is already changing moment by moment. The idea of a fixed self dissolves, and with it the terror of its disappearance. This does not give you certainty about what happens after death. It gives you clarity about what is happening now, and that clarity is enough. Life becomes less about arriving somewhere and more about participating fully. You still plan, you still remember, you still think, but lightly. Thought becomes a tool again, not a tyrant. So consciousness remains a blessing and a curse only as long as it is misunderstood. Once seen clearly, it is neither. It is simply the field in which all experience happens, joy and sorrow, clarity and confusion, birth and death. You do not need to escape consciousness to find peace. You do not need to transcend it or improve it. You only need to stop fighting it. When you do, you discover something very simple and very profound. Awareness was never the problem. The forgetting was, and remembering gently, honestly, again and again is enough.